chosen non-violence. What happened a week later? Israelis started Operation Cast Lead and perpetrated the most cruel of wars against an unarmed civilian population in Gaza, using white phosphorus on children. Over 1,400 people were massacred. Crimes against humanity for which Israel must be held accountable for the International Criminal Court. They must. If you don't hold them accountable, if there is impunity here, they'll do it again. They'll do it again. Anybody who gets away. It's like a naughty child. If your child does something wrong and you say, "No, darling. No, darling. Maybe you shouldn't do that." Israel must be held accountable, and under the Geneva Conventions, every government that signs the Geneva Conventions has a moral and legal responsibility to see that every member government upholds their international laws and human rights. So Europe and the Irish government, they are complicit with what is happening to the Palestinian people today, which is the ethnic cleansing and apartheid in Palestine. They are complicit with it because not only do they have to look the other way, they are rewarding Israel for its bad behaviour. The governments of Europe have to take a stand. They should not be giving special trading status to Israel. Can you just imagine? Israel doing what it's doing, go to Europe, what do they do? Here you are, how much more? America paying the bill for a military occupation for the Israelis to carry out an ethnic cleansing and apartheid amongst of the Palestinian people, and America foots the bill for that. There are obvious steps here, but the greatest step here to be taken is to say to the Israelis, look, God help you. Did you not realise the consequence of what you were doing? Because in your ethnic, nationalist policies, you have destroyed nearly and carry out ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinian people, and you have set up a system that under the UN is apartheid. There's no doubt about it. You go, you'll see. I was with a South African in Palestine, and he said to me, it's far worse than what we had in South Africa. Far, far worse. Can't believe it's far worse. That, God help Israel, is where they are. Now, they need outside help. They're not going to be able to do it on their own. They're caught up, they're fear, they're afraid. They're a small state surrounded by all these Arab states, and they're afraid. They see themselves as the victim. They don't realise they're the ones with the nuclear weapons and the third most military machine in the world. They're afraid. Now, you have to understand that fear and do nothing that kind of feeds it. But you can't stand back and do nothing while they use that fear as a reason to do what they're doing on the Palestinian people. So I think that there's much to be done. When I say this, I believe passionately there will be peace, because I've met Israelis and Palestinians on the ground doing the non-violence, building the alternative. I believe passionately Israel's nuclear weapons is now on the table, because with the UN saying we need a nuclear-free Middle East and we want a nuclear-free zone there, Israel is the block to that. But the rest of the world is saying we don't want these nuclear weapons. Why should we have nuclear weapons? Well, we have enough schools, we have enough hospitals, why are we using money on nuclear weapons? So the pressure's on. The pressure's on that the weapons will have to be, they'll have to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They'll have to come to the table. They'll have to make peace with the Palestinians and vice versa. And they'll have to make peace with people in the region. Europe did it after the Second World War. They built economics. They made it economically right that they should build the links and stop the wars. So, I mean, that's why I passionately believe that it will happen. But I think that Europe together with the Arab League, who put on the table years ago an Arab League plan that helps point the way forward, that the Americans have put to the side and are ignoring. They put that on the table, and there's that Arab League plan. There are things in it that can come out and help move the process forward. I don't know whether it's going to be 1 state, 2 states, 100 states. It's not my business. It's not my business. I sat in a room in Jerusalem and I seen the arguments, 1 state, 2 state, 3 state, and I said, God help us. I don't know what's going to be. All I know is take the guns out of it and sit down and stop killing each other and sort the problem out. And that applies to all of us now in our world today. Let's take out the war option, the nuclear weapons options. Let's put on the table the human rights, the international laws, the friendships, the ability of civilized men and women to say, I don't agree with your politics, but by God, I'm not going to kill you for them. I am hopeful, and I think it can be done. And I thank all of you tonight for coming along and being part of that change in our world today.
Moments like this, when you hear bold and radical voices talking in the way that you've talked, Mairead, that we begin hopefully to recognise that if we can hang on to certain truths, if we can engage with particular ideas, and if we can recognise the responsibility that we each have, and for me that's what you spoke about so eloquently, to be agents for change, then peace isn't just possible, it's inevitable. And its inevitability, of course, is dependent upon whether or not we're prepared to say enough and get involved and do everything that we can do to support rather than force change, because I think you're absolutely right, you can't force change. I've got to say, if ever we want to look back and understand how peace has been possible in our own place, I think we only have to listen to voices like Mairead's who really explain how and why peace in the context of our own island was also inevitable. So thank you very much, it's been a real honour to listen to you, Mairead. There's another voice that, of course, we can't hear. Mordechai Vanunu, known to many of you, is an Israeli anti-nuclear activist who was released from prison 6 years ago in Israel. As you know, Mordechai isn't allowed to leave Israel. His freedom of movement within the country is severely curtailed, and he's banned from communicating with any foreigner, including journalists. But we need to hear about Mordechai. We need to hear about his experience. We need to understand what Mordechai is living with and being through. We need to understand the real human experience. We need to try to find a way to hear his voice in some manner. So I'm delighted that this evening our final speaker is a personal friend of Mordechai's, Barbara Faibish, and Barbara is going to talk to us directly now. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Mordechai Vanunu was born into a religious family in Morocco in 1954. In the 1950s and 60s, Mossad worked hard to recruit Jews to come to Israel to swell the Jewish population. In 1963, the Vanunu family emigrated to Israel and found themselves in Beersheba, in the Negev desert, in circumstances very different from their comfortable middle-class life in colourful multicultural Marrakesh, where Solomon Vanunu, the head of the family, had been a merchant. Amongst his 5 brothers and 5 sisters, Mordechai formed the closest bond with his younger brother Meir. This bond, formed in childhood, has remained unbroken over the years. Meir has spent the last 24 years campaigning for and supporting Mordechai with unwavering loyalty. After leaving the army in 1972, Mordechai studied physics at the University of Tel Aviv. But because of the 1973 war, in which he had to serve as a reserve sergeant in the Sappers, he found it difficult to continue his studies. 2 years later, in 1976, he trained as a nuclear technician and joined Israel's nuclear center at Dimona. In 1979, he went back to university during the day to study geography and philosophy at Beersheba University, while he worked night shifts from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. At this time, the Cold War and the fear of nuclear war were the major political tensions in the world. Dimona was presented to the world as a peaceful research centre, and in the early days, the Prime Minister Ben Gurion said that it was a textile factory. Israel's statement for the last 5 decades has been carefully formulated, stating, "We will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East." As years went on, Mordechai realised the true nature of this nuclear centre and the depth and meaning of the production and processes he was involved with. But the deeper he went into his studies in philosophy for his first degree and then masters in the early 80s, together with the experiences of the 1982 attack on Lebanon by Israel, with massive air bombardments, killing many thousands, and the well-known slaughter of Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, he saw at first hand the consequences of war for innocent civilians and became a pacifist. His studies, experiences in the army, and what he saw at Dimona brought about his decision that the Israeli people and the world should be made aware of the extent of Israel's secret nuclear activities. He secretly took photos of the nuclear production at Dimona. In mid-1985 he left Dimona, and in January 1986 set off to travel to the Far East in Australia with the undeveloped photos in his backpack. Through contacts in Australia, he'd met Peter Hunim of the London Sunday Times. Mordechai would have preferred that the information be published without reference to him, as he feared for his life. But the newspaper insisted he come to London. At one time, he thought about burning the photos and forgetting about it. The Sunday Times took a very long time to publish while they were making checks on his information. Mordechai became worried. It had been already 4 or 5 weeks since his initial contact with them. He decided it would be a good idea to get away from London for a while. It was then he met the honey trap, Cindy, who claimed that her sister was a journalist who worked in Rome. Cindy was an American who worked for Mossad. Before the story was printed, he was lured to Rome, drugged and kidnapped on the 30th September 1986. He was taken to Israel, where he was put on trial and sentenced to 18 years in prison for espionage and treason. 5 days after he went missing, Andrew Neil, the editor, decided to print the story on the 5th of October 1986. The 3 front pages of the Sunday Times gave Mordechai's testimony of Israel's nuclear weapons. The experts who examined him concluded that Israel had around 200 nuclear warheads at that time, which matched the nuclear capabilities of the French or the British. The world was shocked by the news that Israel had the A-bomb as well as the H and neutron bombs. Around this time, Germany built and gave Israel submarines with nuclear missile launching capabilities, Second Strike. Mordechai spent 11.5 years in solitary confinement in a cell of 2 by 3 meters with no window. These conditions were extremely harsh, and for the first 2.5 years, a fluorescent light was kept on 24 hours a day. The purpose was sleep deprivation, and the prison guards knocked on his door every half hour to wake him. He was not allowed to speak or explain himself to the public. His voice was not heard in all those 18 years. These incredible conditions that Amnesty International declared to be cruel, inhumane and degrading drove him close to losing his sanity. In 1998, he was released from isolation, still kept in the same cell for the next 6 years, but allowed to spend some time outside the cell. There have been many campaigns for his release. His brother Mayor started the Vanunu campaign in London. The founder of Amnesty International, Peter